Welcome, genre fans! In this episode, we'll be exploring the film subgenre folk horror. Folk horror is a broad global genre with common tropes spanning silent film to the present day. The most common trope is that folk horror occurs in an isolated rural landscape with an outsider or small group of outsiders conflicting with the local folk. In more explicitly urban settings like Chicago's Cabrini Green projects in Candyman or the anonymous English town in His House, the genre diverges into what author Adam Scoville calls urban weird. The insular community in a folk horror film is usually defined by a tradition of old ways steeped in esoteric folklore. Once the locals entrap the outsider in their folkloric system, the result is a crescendo of violence, driven by a human cult or some supernatural entity. A contemporary example would be Wakewood. A couple grieving over the loss of their daughter moved to the titular village. In an atmosphere of secretive townsfolk and strange goings-on, they make a Pet Sematary-style pact to get 3 more days with their daughter at a steep price. In addition to the magic component of reanimation, the main couple ends up increasingly isolated, their car dying at the edge of town as they try to escape. The town and the woods entrap them, making them forever residents of Wakewood. Frequently, the outsider ensnared by the old traditions meets a violent end: blood sacrifice, persecution, mental breakdown, transfiguration, or death. In The City of the Dead, curious university student Nan travels to an isolated village in the American Northeast to continue her witchcraft studies. From the moment she enters the misty road leading to the village of Whitewood, the specter of a long-dead witchfinder posing as a hitchhiker in her passenger seat, Nan is trapped. She encounters several strange townfolk, including the reverend of an abandoned church, dancers who are actually witches, and an innkeeper/coven leader who lures Nan down to the cellar to be sacrificed on a satanic altar. The eruption of violence in folk horror is pronounced, with filmmakers stitching several shocking occult scenes into an otherwise pastoral or banal everyday narrative and creating violence through the juxtaposition of opposite tones. The centerpiece scene in The Wicker Man is the most iconic example. In contemporary folk horror, Kill List creates a superficially placid atmosphere punctuated by acts of violence. The main anti-hero, Jay, and his friend Gal are ex-military performing a series of contract killings for a mysterious client, standing in contrast to the warm, mundane world of Jay's home. This makes the climactic cult scene deeply effective. The separate spheres of the modern world and the old pagan ways brought together in a devastating apotheosis of violence. Many folk horror films use overt supernatural forces as the antagonistic element. In Noroi the Cursed, for example, there is a terrifying cult whose demonic practices result in real-world hauntings. Documentarian Kobayashi's investigation of paranormal phenomena leads him to a woman and her son undergoing what appears to be demonic possession. His search for the woman leads him to a dam, which turns out to be the site of a former village. The villagers had summoned the demon spirit Kagutaba, only to ritualistically appease and imprison it each year. The supernatural force itself, rather than the local community, emerges as outsider Kobayashi's adversary. Often, folk horror uses elements like cursed objects and ghostly malevolence. Several Japanese films from the 1960s prominently feature traditional medieval ghost stories from kabuki and no theatrical traditions. Kuroneko tells the story of the ghosts of 2 women who were raped and murdered by a samurai in the opening scene. The dead women become supernatural entities, seducing samurai in human form before killing them in vengeance. They haunt a particular place, the Rajamon Gates, bringing outsiders into an illusory mansion amid atmospheric boggy landscapes and flying wraiths. The folk in folk horror can refer not to an insular pagan village, but to literal folk tales and fairy tales, local legends, even dramatizations of transcripts from witch trials. Leptirica tells the story of a vampiric creature haunting the mill of a small village. Produced under heavy state censorship and violence in 1970s Serbia, the filmmakers were forced to stick close to the source material and make political statements in subtle ways. The Juniper Tree is an adaptation of a Grimm's tale of the same name transported to medieval Iceland. It seems to serve as a parable. 2 sisters flee their village after their mother is stoned and burned as a witch, only to face a new, more intimate persecution themselves on an isolated homestead with a widowed farmer and his son. The elder Katla binds the farmer to her with simple folk magic rituals, while the younger Margit genuinely has the gift of second sight. When sun son Jonas lashes out against Katla, the film descends into cannibalism, transfiguration, and death. Margate's coming of age as a woman is to become a witch, ostracized and imperiled. Witch trials are fertile grounds for folk horror. They feature small communities driven mad by the unknown, requiring the sacrifice of an outsider as release. Witchhammer is set during the height of the Inquisition period in 17th century Moravia. Based on a novel featuring several real-life figures, Witchhammer is an allegory of life under Soviet communism. The greedy inquisitor Bablik von Edelstadt drives the village into panic and superstition with show trials and tortures. His despotism and vile actions, rather than any supernatural force or pagan rites, are the true horror. Folk horror is rooted in oral traditions and a broader mythology of local legends. A good example of this would be Grimm's fairy tales, which is an outpouring of folk stories from old books and interviews with friends and family. The brothers Grimm not only wrote The Juniper Tree, mentioned earlier, but the story inspiration for Gretel and Hansel, and Angela Carter's adaptations in The Company of Wolves. Victorian and Gothic literature, particularly ghost stories, display many of the tonal and landscape elements that will later show up in film. The foggy London streets of Bleak House by Charles Dickens and the atmospheric ghost stories of M.R. James are fundamental precursors. Many works of M.R. James have been adapted to TV and film, as in The Stalls of Barchester, the BBC teleplay Whistle and I'll Come to You, and The Night of the Demon. 20th century American writer H.P. Lovecraft is another widely influential figure in the folk horror genre. His Cthulhu mythos stories often feature everyman outsiders who journey into or settle upon land not intended for them, where strange otherworldly events unfold. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, a university student takes an antiquarian tour of New England, deciding to explore the isolated port town of Innsmouth. After attempting to interview several weird and threatening townsfolk, he learns of a race of malignant underwater creatures deeply embedded into the town's bizarre history. The sea creatures, called Deep Ones, try to keep the narrator from leaving, but he escapes only to discover that he is genetically linked to them. This Lovecraftian constellation of tropes crop up constantly in folk horror films. The outsider hero entering an unwelcoming, isolated place, the inhabitants imprisoning the hero, the clash of ancient systems with the modern rational world, the use of nature and landscape to create an atmosphere of paranoid terror, and the deployment of mythological forces which results in the narrator's ultimate undoing. Arguably, Lovecraft's influence laid the groundwork for white supremacy in the worldview of most folk horror, and more recent criticism of that ideology in contemporary works like Midsommar. Even though many associate folk horror with late 60s, early 70s England, or the recent global revival of the 2010s, the genre has deeper roots in silent film. Hoxton juxtaposes documentary segments on the history of witchcraft, insanity, and neurosis with the fictionalized stories of witch trials, medieval superstition, and persecution. Other silent films, such as Vampire and Nosferatu, are based on novels rooted in vampire folklore. The Finnish film The White Reindeer can be considered the first proper folk horror, an international triumph and winner of the Best Fairy Tale Film at the 1953 Cannes Film Festival. The White Reindeer tells the story of a young woman who visits a shaman in order to spice up her marriage, only to be transformed into the titular mythic reindeer. Director Eric Blomberg draws on Sami folklore and shamanism to create the stark imagery that would recur in later folk horror. In the 1960s, several striking Japanese films told folkloric stories of ghosts, demons, and haunted places. Onibaba is a period piece whose title refers to demonic hags who have resorted to murder and often cannibalism. The story centers on an old woman and her daughter-in-law killing soldiers and stripping their bodies for sustenance. The old woman transforms into a demon while trying to foil a passionate love affair between her widowed daughter-in-law and a neighboring man returned from the war. On is a folk tale anthology based on the 1904 collection of ghost stories by Lafcadio Hearn. In the 2010 documentary A History of Horror, Mark Gatiss uses the term folk horror to describe a cluster of films and teleplays released in England in the late 60s through the 1970s. This documentary and a series of academic conferences on folk horror in the early 2000s helped coalesce an informal trilogy of films and several innovative BBC teleplays into the foundation of the folk horror genre as we currently understand it.
From the late 60s, a new generation of British directors avoided the Gothic clichés by stepping even further away from the modern world. Amongst these are a loose collection of films which we might call folk horror. They shared a common obsession with the British landscape, its folklore and superstitions.
The landmark unholy trinity of folk horror is Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man. Based on the novel of the same name by Ronald Bassett, Witchfinder General is an Inquisition period piece set in a small village during the English Civil War of the 17th century. It tells the true story of infamous witch hunter Matthew Hopkins and his assistant John Stern, who held witch trials to collect fees from the local magistrate and take possession of the property of people they convicted of witchcraft. This continues the theme begun in Hoxton. Evil is not the domain of accused witches, but of the men in power who persecute outsiders. This allegory was particularly relevant in the late 1960s, when people started to view the establishment as corrupt and motivated by brute capitalism. Like Witchhammer to Follow, Witchfinder General portrays an inquisitor as a fear-mongering authority figure. The Blood on Satan's Claw is also a period piece set in a pastoral English village, this time in the 18th century. Ostensibly a tale of demonic possession, it opens on a farmer finding a grotesque face while sowing his fields. The village's youth, led by main antagonist Angel Blake, spurn Christianity and perform rituals to summon the demon Behemoth by transfiguring their victim's flesh. Since the film's events take place in a small village and the surrounding woods, the setting creates a tone of lurking violence in contrast to picturesque landscapes. Young people in white and muted tones wear leafy crowns while cavorting in the woods, then rape and murder a girl on an altar amid a ruin. This clearly shows anxiety about the darker side of the hippie counterculture. Angel's appearance both affirms her role as an Aryan figure and belies her Manson girl proclivities. Her cult rebels against the Anglican Church and the older generation, but they also kill their peers and manifest a literal demon. The most influential of the unholy trinity is cult classic The Wicker Man. Police Sergeant Howie, who represents the modern rational city and Christian morality, comes to an insular pagan community on the Scottish island of Summerisle in search of a missing 12-year-old girl. The townspeople's lives are steeped in ancient tradition and iconography. As they prepare for their harvest celebration, Howie becomes trapped as a sacrifice. The Wicker Man has many comedic elements as Sergeant Howie is repeatedly scandalized by the pagans of Summerisle, but the film builds to a sudden eruption of violence. This is the imagery we think of when we picture folk horror. Celebrations with youths dancing around a maypole and nude revelers around bonfires slowly becoming sinister when animal masked cult members trap an outsider to be sacrificed in a funeral pyre. Folk horror often displays three separate thematic tendencies. First off, there is the humans are the real monsters hypothesis, wherein witchcraft, sorcery, the occult, the supernatural, and demonic creatures do not properly exist in reality, but are inventions of humans with nefarious motives, intentional or unwitting. Neither the audience nor the filmmakers believe that witchcraft is real in Witchfinder General. Matthew Hopkins invents a threat where there is none out of pure greed. In The Wicker Man, the pagans of Summerisle genuinely believe in their harvest sacrifices, but they do not have any power over nature. The final ritual is symbolic and empty, resulting in a senseless death. In the second thematic tendency, the old ways remain. Supernatural forces actually exist, and esoteric beliefs are all true. The Blood on Satan's Claw shows body parts being harvested by a cult to create the physical form of a real demon in the end. This coexists with the first thematic tendency to a degree, with the murderous youths projecting their ideology onto nature and showing that humans can be monstrous. However, the existence of Behemoth is key to the tonal effect of the film. Another example is Alice Allison's birthday. In the beginning, we could explain the seemingly paranormal death of Allison's sister as the fabrication of a traumatized teenager making sense of a horrible accident. Once it becomes clear that Allison's aunt and uncle are part of a cult, it is similarly facile to understand boyfriend Pete's ordeal as the result of human actions. However, by the film's climax, it is clear that the ritual to transfer the soul of ancient witch Myrna from Grandmother Thorne into Allison's body is very real. The third thematic tendency consists of adaptations of folklore, fairy tales, and myths, providing some social commentary relevant for modern audiences. Unlike films in the old ways remain model, this folk wisdom still applies model frames its narratives as fabular and does not rely on the reality versus supernatural binary. A prime example of this would be November, a tale set in a mythic village in 19th century Estonia. Its world is populated with creepy automatons that steal livestock, a personified Black Death, and the devil himself. The central narrative is about a peasant man who falls in love with a German baroness who his local admirer tries to become before ultimately killing herself. Framed as a fairy tale, the film grapples with a long history of occupation and the desire for national sovereignty. Several BBC teleplays exemplify the genre by picking up the same tropes and thematic threads as the trilogy. Nigel Neal's The Stone Tape is a ghost story that displayed the old ways remain thematic thread. A team of scientists find that the old manor estate serving as their headquarters really is haunted. The Foundation is in fact a recording medium for Victorian ghosts and ultimately a truly ancient primeval force. Penda's Fen is a more experimental take on folk horror tropes in the folk wisdom still applies vein. Main protagonist Stephen navigates his sexuality amid earthy yet surreal visions of angels and pagan figures. In Robin Redbreast, Londoner Nora Palmer recovers from a failed years-long love affair by retreating to a cottage in rural southern England, where she becomes the outsider in a small, eccentric town. She gets pregnant after a one-night stand with Edgar, a younger local man nicknamed Robin, considers but decides against getting an abortion, and is soon trapped in her home. The villagers cut her phone lines and tamper with her car, and the bus out of town refuses her service. Isolated and certain she herself is in danger, Nora finds that the townspeople have executed Edgar as Robin Redbreast, a sacrificial totem for the town's pagan religion. They tell Nora her baby will be the next Robin Redbreast in perhaps 20 years' time. This film fits into the humans are the real monsters tendency. The villagers project their views onto nature and continue an endless cycle of senseless human sacrifice. And that's our introduction to the folk horror subgenre. We'll see you next time for a deeper exploration of folk horror by region. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and select all so you can know first thing when we post. Don't forget to let your film nerd friends know about our channel. Thanks. See you soon.